Good morning, everyone. So let's start with this first code of the day. Thanks for attending. My name is Akim Juillerat. I'm a software architect at Camp in Switzerland. It's been like 6 years now that I'm there and contributing to the OCA. So the talk of today, to begin with, is how to contribute to the OCA, doing reviews and submitting your first module. So as introduction, we'll see a bit of the OCA guidelines that are provided by the association. Then we'll talk about the reviews. Why are we doing code review? What is the mindset we should have when doing this? Talk about the review process itself. And then a few things about how to submit your first module or, your first contribution. So we will see how to get started in this and how to be OCA compliant. In terms of guidelines, the OCA is providing a really nice document that is called contributing.rst. I would recommend to read it, go through it at least once, and it's good to have a look at it once upon a time when you have some doubts, like about file naming, the structure of the module, or there are some good points, like for example about transaction isolation and so on. It's quite useful. And then in terms of useful resources, I link there the repository of the maintainer tools. There is a module template, for example, that you can use when you create a module where you have all the files that you need. There is a manifest with all the possible keys that you can use while doing a module. It could be like for when you don't know how to do a pre-init hook or something like this, or if you have to do some migration scripts, it could be quite useful. On the same repository, there is also a wiki that we don't necessarily think of, including some migration guides when you have to migrate a module from one version to another, and also an FAQ, how to translate, and things like this. It could still be improved, but at least it's some useful resources. Then, about code reviews. Question is, why do we review code? I highlighted 3 points there, and the first one is to save time. Save time by detecting issues earlier. It's faster and easier to fix it. It's also easier to fix your implementation when you're not in the pressure of having a client using your code in production. That's where the review are quite useful. And also, it's much faster to fix your thing when you are working on it, and not like months after when you don't remember what it was all about. It's also to find bugs. Anyone can do bugs, and I mean, it happens a lot. So catching accidental errors is easier to do when having a review. And the review phase is also the last time to spot design issues. Your code could work well, but sometimes you have a design issue in how you structure your thing. And while we are still reviewing it and not having it pushed to production, it's much easier to solve it, change the design, and so on. Improve the maintainability by knowing that people will review your work and have a look at what you did. It also helps to keep your work clean. So it also helps to keep a good integrity and consistency of what you did. It also allows to improve the readability of the code, like variable naming or so on, name your function correctly. And it's also sometimes clear for the author, but not for the reviewer, what you did, if you don't have the context in which you did it, or maybe a few months later you won't remember what it was all about. So having a review leads usually to a better code and a more understandable one. So about the mindset, when doing code review, I would say we should think positive, be nice and patient. The goal of a review is mostly to improve the code and nothing else. We should learn from the feedbacks and not get offended at them. It goes with the next point that says, you are not your code. So whatever the review is saying, don't take it personally. The only goal should be to have a better code and something working better. Also, we should empathize with the author situation. Understand the context in which the code was done, because well, sometimes you are under pressure, you have to do things fast, and then you don't do it properly as it should be done. It's not necessarily because you are bad, but sometimes it's all about the context in which it's done. Next point I wrote is everyone can give feedbacks and everyone needs reviews. Whatever your seniority in Odoo or in development, you need some review. And newcomers are also welcome to do some reviews. It's an opportunity to learn, but also, if it's not understandable, it helps the author to change and make it even more understandable, which is a good thing in the long run. And finally, I wrote, be constructive when doing this. It's always better to ask by doing your review rather than asserting. Sometimes you might assert something and just oversee something that you didn't know because of the context in which the code was written. So if something doesn't look good, I would always recommend ask a question, why did you do this? And not say, do it this other way. There might be some hidden reasons. So it's an opportunity also for the author to explain what he did and maybe even add a few code comments so that it's more understandable. Finally, I linked a really interesting article that we recommend reading sometimes. It's the 10 Commandments of the Egoless Programming. It's really nice. Reading it once a year doesn't harm, and it's a funny way how it's written, so take the opportunity to read it, I would say. Then the review process itself. When starting with a review, I would say first thing to do is to learn about the scope and the context. Understand the perimeter of the changes, because a thing might be done in a specific context that you don't necessarily know about. The description of the module is usually the first thing to check. Also, it helps just to see the scope. Check that the code does what is stated in the module description. I mean, it's okay if the module does a bit more than the module description, but the best is having the code that does exactly what the module states. On the other hand, if the code doesn't do what the module description states, that's usually not good. Check that the changes matches the commit messages. Well, sometimes it's okay to have a single commit, say, okay, I just added this new module, but it's usually good to write an interesting commit message explaining why you did the change, for example, and checking that what is stated in a commit message is reflecting in the code, including in this commit. Not have things that are mixed in between commits that say other things. The review process is also there to check unwanted side effects. Someone might do a module that is working well, for example, in a two-step delivery, but it wouldn't work in one step. And sometimes you don't think about all the possibility that Odoo offers to be configured. So having some reviews help also to consider these other things. And checking the overall design. I mean, anytime we do some code, we have to make choices. These choices are usually disputable. They can be talked about in the review, and we can see if it makes sense to change. Sometimes it also allows extensibility. Like if you have a dictionary of values to prepare, it could be nice to have a function for that. And also not breaking the inheritance chain, which is a fundamental concept of Odoo. Okay. Once you went through this, you should either approve, comment, or request changes. So if the code does what is stated, and the previous check that I mentioned earlier didn't raise any issue, you must approve the PR. I mean, you can still make comments, improvement suggestion, ask for clarification if you don't understand something. Nitpicking is okay, but just state it. It's okay to say, okay, you could do this better, but it shouldn't be a reason to block a PR. For example, you can just write in your comment, feel free to ignore or not blocking, and it's usually a nice way to just propose improvements without blocking anything. Then if the code does what's stated, but the code is not efficient, you can still comment and suggest how to improve it. You could also be nice by opening another PR targeting the branch of the pull request to provide what you think should be done. It could also lead to the author adding some comments in the code, leaving some to-dos, for example, if it's not urgent. You can ask, please change this. But also, it's important to distinguish what is required for the PR to be merged or general improvements. I mean, general improvements can always be done later on. So I would say comment if you see something wrong, but try to approve as much as you can. And then if the code doesn't do what it stated, or you see some dangerous side effects, then you can request changes. But it should be the exception and not the rule. By this, as I wrote at the last point, if you request changes, it means you commit yourself for another review once the author will have done these changes. It's still to be done sometimes because something, of course, isn't working, and we don't want such a code to be pushed somewhere. But using sparsely, and yeah, try as much to approve and comment if you can. Also, GitHub provides a really useful tool to do some suggestion, highlighting the code and proposing how you would change it. It's really nice to do for the author of a PR, so he doesn't have to go back to his code and change and push and so on. So finally, a PR doesn't need to be perfect to be merged. That's important. As long as it's functional and it doesn't break anything, there's no reason not to merge a PR. It can always be improved. I mean, every module could have some failures and can be done later on. In the OCA, I think a few years ago, we introduced also some maturity levels. It's akin to the manifest. It's called development status. And you can state a module is in alpha, beta, stable, or mature version. And I mean, if it's an alpha module, there's just no sense of nitpicking. And then these things can be increased, like for example, from alpha to beta, from beta to stable when migrating, because you can assume that if the module didn't do any, if the author didn't do any change on a version, it's already functioning. But at the beginning, these maturity levels are quite good in the sense like, even if your implementation is not that good, I would say you can still have it merged, try it out, and fixing it later on. Also consider adding entries in the module roadmap.rst, which is a small fragment that is used to build the README automatically by the bot. Well, it's better to fix, but sometimes you don't have the time to rework everything you did. So adding an entry there could be enough to have the PR merged. We don't need, as I said before, we don't need to improve everything at once. The goal with this is we should try to merge as many PR as possible instead of leaving them open and be closed by the OCA bot after a while. Usually when someone is looking for a module of the OCA, he will go either to the Odoo App Store or the Odoo Community App Store and look for a module there. And if he doesn't find it, well, that's it. He won't look into the open PRs. And there are even less people that will look into closed PR if a module is interesting. So it can happen that you do the nice module, you don't get the review, then it's closed. Your work won't be used as much as if it was merged and someone can find it on the App Store. Then, about submitting your first module. It could have been your first contribution, but that's how I named the talk when I had to propose something. To get started, I would say fork the repository and clone it on your machine. Then, when you have it cloned on your machine, install pre-commit. It's a small Python program that will run some hooks when you commit to format your code, fix some issues, and so on. And then start coding. So, once your code is done, I won't get into the details, try to be OCA compliant. And by being OCA compliant, there are a few points to take attention to. First is to follow the guidelines in terms of file naming and so on. Don't leave, for example, a bare empty commit in your code. And the contributing guide that I linked at the beginning of the presentation will tell you everything about this. Take care of the README generation. By this, I mean add the right files in the README folder so that the README is generated properly. And take the time to write a good description, because the description is the first thing someone will see about your module. Well, he will look for something by the name, maybe, and then look at the description. If the description states something interesting, then the people will use your module. If it doesn't state anything, there's less chances that someone will use it. So yeah, follow the recommendation. Try to add the other files about usage and configuration if it's needed. And in your PR, having an empty README is okay. If you don't want to generate it yourself, it will be generated by the bot once the PR is merged. And finally, be kind to the reviewers. So by this, I mean write and run the tests. It's always good to have your code that is tested. We have some test coverage also on our repository that will highlight you the lines of your code that are not tested. And the tests in itself allow to document what your module is supposed to do, on top of ensuring there won't be any regression when someone is doing a change in it. Check the diff. Make sure that what you commit is what you want and you don't have some files you didn't want to, or that you didn't forget anything. Try to write proper commit messages. There are lots of interesting guides in the internet how to write a good commit message, but yeah, try to be explicit. If you have to add some more commits afterwards, use fix-ups for corrections so that everyone can check only the changes you did. And at the end, once your PR is approved, rebase and squash it before the merged, but try to use the fix-ups for the corrections. Review yourself. So go through the process I just mentioned before. Help usually to find some things you didn't see before. While you are developing, I mean, you are fixed into your code, you don't see, but then taking a step back, trying to review what you did, usually helps spotting some issues that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So yeah, you get a different point of view from GitHub that you would from your editor, and that's also interesting to see. It helps to the reviewer's work if you spot the easy things that a review would have spotted. And once all of this is done, you can open the pull request. There are also some guidelines for the OCA. Just check what the other PRs do. Try to write a version of a do in the title of your PR. Don't forget the description. I mean, having the module description or the change you did in the description of the PR also helps the reviewer to get some context on what you are doing. And link also any unmerged dependencies. Like sometimes you will submit a few PRs that are depending on each other. Try to link it so that the reviewer can go through any dependency of your module and make sure that everything will get merged. And at the end, make sure Travis is happy, Runbot is happy, everything is green. It's usually easier to review when you are sure the PR will be accepted when your review is done. You can also try to improve the coverage by adding tests. And once all of this is done, well, it should be good. Ask people for reviews. Make some review to other people's PR. Helps these other people to review your work as well. And that's it. So most of this presentation was actually taken by the internal handbook we use. I would like to thank Gawain for the huge work he did in our company for this. And now, if you have questions, please go on. Yes? Yeah?
One thing is, I would suggest everybody to use draft or pull requests a lot.
I didn't get you, sorry. Maybe
I'm not so good at screening, sorry.
So I would like to add two things. GitHub has the function of draft pull requests. So this way you can open a pull request that's not really meant to be reviewed by people. And that way you can mark it that you're not yet really sure everything will be fine. That is a very good option if you're a starter and maybe you don't run all the tests locally, so you're not sure they are going to work, because it is actually pretty damning. If you open a pull request, it fails. People see this failing, and well, then they might ignore it for the rest of the life cycle of the pull request. I do that at least. I would suggest use draft pull requests a lot. And for the reviewer side, a lot of people don't know the function of GitHub where you can inline in a commit suggest exactly the change you want the person to do. And this helps a lot with resolving misunderstandings or not having the misunderstanding in the first place. Talk code, we all know that. Not everybody is a native speaker of English, and sometimes that messes up things. But we all speak Python. So use it as much as possible, I think.
Thank you, totally agree. Any other question?
When choosing someone else's pull request, would you choose a longer standing PR for an older version or a newer PR for a newer version?
Well, I would say try to review what is interesting for you. That's the first thing, and I think that's what everyone is doing. You review what you need, usually. When you have time, like during these OCA days, whatever you feel comfortable with is good to be reviewed. If there is a PR on an old version that you are used to work with, you can go and review it. If you feel better by doing reviews on new modules in newer version, I would say it's up to you. Any contribution is a good one.
I have two questions. One question I have is something I sometimes ask myself, is if I have a module and I've made it and it works and it's good, how do I determine whether I should submit it to the OCA or whether it's fit for the OCA?
Well, that's a good question. I would say the OCA has lots of different repositories. So the first thing, if you want to contribute it, there shouldn't be any stopper. Try to find the right repository for it, and if it's about something totally new that the OCA doesn't have, you can always write on the mailing list. There is a contributors mailing list, and say, for example, okay, I have this nice project about, I don't know, like, I'm managing animals, for example. I know there is a module for that, I think, in the OCA. I want a new repository for this, and then you can go on. I would say if you want to contribute, you can almost contribute anything. It might have some value.
Yes. The second question is, suppose I find a bug in version 12 of a module, and obviously all the later versions are also affected. What is the procedure for making sure that the fix lands in every single version in the OCA?
Well, there isn't a really defined procedure for that, but if you if you spot a bug, like first thing is open the PR in the version that you spot it in. You will need the fix for yourself, so just open the PR in this version, and then you are free to forward port or to backport it to any other version. I mean, if you don't have the time to do it, you can still try to cherry pick your commit to another branch. Sorry? Okay, yeah, Sebastian, one of my colleagues did a new module actually, a new helper that is called OCA port and could be also quite useful for this. So I would suggest have a look at his talk, but yeah, nothing's blocking. You can just either maybe open an issue, for example, and say, okay, I spot this bug in this version, I correct it through this PR, and it's to be done in the other versions.
The talk by Sébastien about the OCA port is tomorrow at 3 p.m.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Maybe you talk at the beginning because I was late, but what about functional reviews or only code review?
Well, functional reviews are welcome anytime. I would say even for people that are not doing Python, there is this new run bot that is maintained by Stefan, and it is working quite well. You can rebuild it, relaunch the thing if you need to test. You can still test it on the run bot and say, okay, it works. It does what we are expecting. Having some review can also, well, some functional review can also lead to a better description in the module, a better documentation. So I would say, yeah, any contribution is a good one.
That's specifically super valuable for finance stuff, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have a good description in your module, yeah, it will be much easier to be found. So, yeah, any contribution is really a good one. Anybody else? Well, thank you then, and enjoy these OCA Days.